You will see visible patrols. You will see in the downtown core, in and around the stadiums, at all of the different various special event sites. And we have been working tirelessly with our federal partners to assist.
That's Seattle Police Chief Adrian Diaz there talking about how the SPD and other law enforcement partners ramped up security this week around the All-Star Game. Well, what's the story behind the story for the SPD as a new mid-year accountability report is released to the City Council this week? Plus, what's going up on the rooftop of Pioneer Square businesses, and what barriers are Seattle's business improvement areas, its small businesses and BIAs, facing in the summer of 2023? Well, we are discussing these questions and so much more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are mine. And I'm joined once again with my co-host, David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I got to say, it was a very impressive home run derby leading up to the All-Star Game this week. Did Julio have the best single round of derby history because he's awesome or because he had a great pitcher? What do you think?
I mean, I think both of those things. But, you look at some of the pitches that the other batters got, and they weren't quite in their sweet spots. That first round, he was just putting them exactly in the right place every time. I actually think of this as more of a batting practice competition than anything else.
Interesting point. It's and also interesting to note that Pete Alonso, who was up against him, actually has switched pitchers 3 times now over the past 4 years. So maybe there's something to it. Franmi Pena is a childhood friend of Julio's, and he was the pitcher and did an awesome job. I'm going to give extra points to Adley Rutschman, who exited in the first round there, but a Portland kid, had his dad pitching to him. Extra points for that. And then also switch hitting. That guy was awesome. Anyway, that was a lot of fun. Yeah. Well, thank you, David. Thank you for being here. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our show patrons, Steve and Sean, over the last few weeks. Appreciate it. And to those not supporting the show just yet, well, make sure you come on board here. You get your very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal coming your way if you can jump in at the $5 level. Sean, Steve, Britt, I know I sent you a sticker here, so please send in an action photo of that decal on a coffee mug or wherever it ends up. We'll feature it on the show. Always fun. You will see that photo on Converge Media. Converge airs the video version of this podcast Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get going with right here, right now. Well, we are going to talk about how law enforcement has been handling All-Star Game festivities in just a little bit. But first, I wanted to talk about a new mid-year police accountability report the City Council's Public Safety Committee is reviewing this week. David, there's a ton to take in here, a 50-plus page report coming from the 3 agencies that monitor the SPD. Just to break that down, folks, it's the Community Police Commission, which provides public input, the Office of Police Accountability, which handles individual complaints about the SPD, and the Office of the Inspector General, which helps craft policy for the SPD. A few highlights I saw here, David. The way the numbers are trending, SPD is on pace to have a higher number of allegations about improper use of force and biased policing this year compared to last. Now, the overall numbers have been trending down since the protests of 2020 when they spiked here and all across the country. But David, I was just thinking about this. It's been such a difficult trend, I guess, for the SPD to shake, especially as it's trying to make the case that federal oversight on these matters, this consent decree that's been in place for more than a decade, should end. Some thoughts about this and where these use of force and biased policing complaints are going.
Yeah, it's the tracking by allegations is always a little tricky because, as we saw,
actually true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And, certain other things can drive that spike than just the act of, more allegations doesn't necessarily mean more misconduct. It could, but, as we saw in 2020, it's just a lot more focus on the police department, a lot more public interactions. If the city's doing a good job at making it known how to bring complaints, then that would drive an increase too. I think we see this with, sexual assault reporting, for example. We saw increases after a lot of the Me Too stuff. Doesn't necessarily mean that there is more instances of sexual assault, just that people know and are thinking more about how to access that. So, it's hard to parse how much of this is allegation. There's actually an increase in allegations versus people are just kind of maybe more aware of the system. And if it's the latter in some ways, that's actually a good thing because that would suggest that the system is starting to maybe do what it should. But, as you talked about, the the accountability system for the police department has been the kind of thorn in this whole reform piece. There's been a lot of back and forth on this, some measures passed that were then kind of reduced a bit by the union contract. And I think there's also still a big perception that, especially the Office of Police Accountability, true or not, I think there's a perception that it's sort of the policing itself. And, at the end of the day, these systems are there to uphold certain rules around conduct and to dole out discipline if necessary. But if you disagree with the rules to begin with, you're probably not going to invest a lot of faith in what, say, the OPA does in upholding those rules, because, this whole accountability system was sort of supposed to be the stool upon which a lot of the reforms
rested. The three-legged stool, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I think the jury's still out on it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's really interesting you bring that up, David, because the OPA is actually doing a listening tour. It has a new director there in Gino Betts, and it's reaching out to try to figure out what the public really knows about it, what the public really knows about some of the different mechanisms that are in place to make sure that officers are doing the right thing. And I guess I would just throw that out there. Does the public know what these agencies are? I know they've been around a little while, but just understanding how they work and how they interact. I do my best to try to bring it up, and I mentioned that part about the public input piece of it with the CPC, how the policy side is sort of with OIG, with the Inspector General, and how the OPA handles the complaints. But do you get a feeling that the general public knows what that is or what that mechanism looks like?
No, I don't think they do. And, which is no fault of the public. It's these word salads, acronym, alphabet soups of acronyms. Right. And it's really difficult to understand. I covered this stuff for a long time, and sometimes I'd even get a little lost in the weeds. So, I think that is actually a detriment to the Seattle Police Department and accountability that, it's hard for the public to put trust in something that they don't really even understand. So, and, frankly, I've seen the readership numbers on stories about some of these systems, and it's tough to make this information digestible and memorable to people. And, I think that is actually a sort of chronic challenge of, government accountability and specifically police accountability, which is, it just gets so lost in bureaucracy. And I think that's how it loses a lot of momentum.
Yeah, I think about that too, with different whistleblower agencies at the state level and how they are not funded or losing funded. I've done those stories myself, and it's interesting to see how this plays out here. It sounds like the OPA will be going out with a lot of different public outreach over the next several months here. Should have a survey that's going out there, and the results should be coming in September. And folks, I really do urge you to check out this report and this public safety meeting about this, because there's a ton of information here about how they're looking at police body cams, how they're looking at how younger kids actually waive their Miranda rights a lot when they're approached by police, and what are the legal implications there. So a lot to this. Again, a 50-plus page report, but I did want to make sure I touched on it with you, David, and thanks for the back and forth there. And hopefully we can keep people talking about these issues, because I think they're important too. I did want to move on to another issue. A full council vote this week on new rooftop amenities for buildings in the Pioneer Square neighborhood. Some interesting changes proposed here. An increase in permissible heights from 12 to 15 feet. Just to break this down here, folks, this is for rooftop penthouses. This would include historic contributing buildings, as they're called. Plus, there's an allowance to add eating and drinking establishments in covered recreational spaces, of buildings built in Pioneer Square since 2008. Applies to just 11 properties here. A slight increase in roof coverage would be allowed for those too. So, David, the basic idea here is that Pioneer Square businesses have not had the same opportunities as in other neighborhoods for this kind of rooftop activity. The council's trying to change that right now. But now I really see this as a balance between, okay, we need to manage some growth here, but we need to keep the historic character of the neighborhood. And I guess the answer is building up on the roof than changing things from the street level view. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's an interesting proposal. I think Pioneer Square, it feels like it needs as much as it can get to be a vibrant place outside of business hours. I think that, at least from my perspective, I think that's been kind of its issue for years now, which is, during boom times, it gets really vibrant in midday. Lines at lunch spots. When I was at Crosscut, we had offices there and for a while, and it was packed during the day, and it felt it had this great energy. But there just wasn't a lot there to keep people around at the end of the day, which I think has made it really vulnerable to economic downturns, COVID, of course.
That doesn't help.
And so, I think creating spaces that people want to be at and participate in outside of those working hours, I think that makes a lot of sense. Of course, there are some restrictions because of historical stuff there, and but I think there's always a balance of, you don't want to like strangle a neighborhood too tightly with historic restrictions so that it can't sort of evolve and become a vibrant place itself. So it seems like an interesting approach.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too, because I was able to get a rooftop view from a building in Pioneer Square. This was just last week at an event, and I'll grant you, not every day in Seattle is sunny, but when it is, wow, is it worth it to be up there maybe 12 floors up and looking out at Elliott Bay. I was thinking about this in a larger sense, David. Do you think we're going to see a push for more of this maybe rooftop amenity type stuff around Pioneer Square and other places as the new Seattle waterfront takes shape and people realize, oh yeah, I don't have to look out at a viaduct anymore. I have an awesome view of Seattle from the water.
Yeah.
Will we see more of this type of activity, I think is my question.
Yeah, I would think so, because before it wasn't actually that good of a view because you were looking at a highway. But as you just said, now it's a great view. So I would think so. Yeah, I think if I'm an apartment condo owner or a hotel or whatever it might be, I think it would be silly to not take advantage of that.
And I know you've done a lot of work down at the waterfront with regard to the bike trail that's coming through. I really see it coming together maybe over the last couple of months here. And I don't know, that the activity along that area there, I know there's a lot of construction still, but do you see the dream taking shape? Is it kind of what you thought it would be on the waterfront there?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised by the size of the road, especially near the ferry. But when you go along the actual waterfront, there's sidewalks that they're putting in are pretty massive, and of course there's a lot of vibrancy down there right now because cruise season is back in full swing, and there's a lot of All-Star game, of course, and there's a lot of tourism and a lot of people in town now, so it is really packed and full. But yeah, you can start to see what that will look like. The overlook walk is pretty far from being done, but its shape is taking
together.
It's taking shape until you can kind of understand how Pike Place will connect to the waterfront. And I think there are certainly people who have a lot of complaints with how it was done. But at the same time, compared to what it was, it is shaping up to be, in some ways, pretty impressive.
Yeah. I can't wait to see the final iteration of that. I think there are definitely a lot of pieces that still need to come together, but that walk coming from Pike Place all the way down to the waterfront there is going to be something special. All right, well, up next, scrutiny of Seattle's approach to public safety, and especially with how it's dealt with homeless encampments leading up to the All-Star game this week. We're looking at that topic next on Now Hear This. Well, we talked about the cleanup effort around T-Mobile Park a few weeks ago on the podcast. The city of Seattle took it next level last Thursday. The city cleared out a major encampment in the Soto neighborhood, a block from the stadium at 3rd and Holgate. The Seattle Times reports 24 people were at this encampment. 7 accepted the city's offer of shelter. 15 RVs parked there either left or were towed. There have been some critics of this move, asserting that the mayor has simply been using the All-Star game as an excuse to displace people. Deputy Mayor Greg Wong says that's not the case.
We do, through our unified care team, an objective matrix of which removals take place. So there's been no artificial ramp up of those in the area around the stadiums in the lead up to the All-Star game. I think we all know that Soto and surrounding areas are disproportionately, they have a lot of encampments and RVs, and so they have, since the mayor took office, had kind of a steady stream of removals that are necessary.
David, what do you make of what the city has been doing with regard to homelessness, especially leading up to the All-Star game?
Yeah, there's sort of two things happening. There's the essential debate around how to respond to homeless encampments and RVs. And then there's the sort of All-Star game thread to this. To my mind, it strains credulity a little bit to say that the clearing out of Soto has nothing to do with the All-Star game, despite the fact that the city has been literally sweeping the streets in other places and doing all sorts of cleanup efforts. And then they happen to think that now is a good idea to clear out a lot of RVs that have been there for a really long time.
Right.
That seems a stretch to me. I think you can have a debate on the merits of moving RVs like this and kind of what happens and why to do that and the follow-up there. But yeah, it's just a little frustrating. I mean, it is also, to my mind, clearly tied to the All-Star game. It's difficult to have an honest conversation about that approach when there's not really an acknowledgement from the mayor's office or the city that there is, in fact, a nexus here.
Right. And I guess it leads me to think, of course, what happens after the All-Star game, because the city is working to open a safe lot for RVs in the Inner Bay neighborhood coming up in August, which can hold a wonderful 26 RVs, a whopping 26 there. What impact is that going to have? Talk to me about that next step. What happens after the All-Star game? And I guess I'm thinking about RVs in particular here.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, 26, obviously, it's not going to cut it. The city has really, there has been talk around finding places for people to park their RVs for years and failed efforts. And it just is one of those things that the city has just not ever come up with a good plan. And executed that and followed through on that plan. It's tough. I mean, on the one hand, people living in RVs, at least they're not on the streets. Some people living in their RVs do okay. But, on the other hand, there's issues that comes with that. I don't know. I mean, it's a really thorny, sticky issue. I don't know that this, again, the fact that this is sort of clearly connected to the All-Star game, if there is a long-term plan here, I don't think the All-Star game is the impetus to that. This feels more like we want people parking in SoDo so that they can come to the game, and we don't want flyover shots by national media of RV encampments. So we're gonna get handle that. This is not, in my mind, a long-term solution to what is a vexing problem for the city.
Agreed. And I think it's a really interesting piece here too, David, because, all right, let's say we build more of these safe lots, right? And I think there has been a push from a few different neighborhoods to make that happen. As interesting as it is, trying to find the actual providers who will run those safe lots, not easy to do. I was looking at this the other day. The city of Bellevue actually has funding set aside for a safe parking program, but it can't find a homeless services organization that's willing to run it. I think these are very fraught situations, not just for cities, but for providers who want to do the right thing, who want to make sure that they're putting together a good program here. But I don't think there's a lot of providers out there that are lining up to do this, it sounds like.
No. I mean, and I think there's also, I think that's sort of true of any kind of temporary transitional housing like that. There's a reason that, for example, Low Income Housing Institute and the city, that hasn't always been a super smooth relationship.
True.
But they seem to be kind of one of very few providers that are up to run, tiny home villages and things like that. And I think it's that, a lot of these providers don't see themselves in the business of emergency stopgap. A lot of them, their motivation is to get people into permanent housing and sort of managing an RV lot or a tiny house village is not that. There's a reason that Mark Dones, the former CEO of the King County Regional Homeless Authority, was not super high on tiny home villages and things like that. And, I think that's probably a belief that's echoed through a lot of homeless service providers, which is that, it's helpful for sort of maybe cleaning up the streets and getting people to a place where you can be more communicative with them. But the sort of direct path to permanent housing, which is the goal, I think, for a lot of people is maybe a little more difficult. And so I think if people with limited money, my sense is service providers are going to be more interested in spending that time and energy on finding somewhere for people to actually live.
Yeah. I'm really interested to see how this new safe lot works out in August here when it's set to open, because I believe the idea is these different people would come in with their RVs. They'd be able to stay there, but there would be an agreement that they would actually leave their RVs there and transition into housing. So it's not trying to keep all these RVs on the street. So I'll be very interested to see how that breaks down. All right, another update this week in the City Light Committee. and Economic Development Committee on barriers to small businesses. This is the committee led by citywide Councilmember Nelson, who often points out she's a small business owner herself, connected to Fremont Brewing. She founded that business. This is a follow-up on a listening session that Councilmember Nelson started back in 2022, had a business roundtable coming out there. And Nelson has been out and about in the community. She visited West Seattle a few weeks ago to listen to concerns from businesses. She's getting input from that business improvement area there, or BIA, in this committee meeting, as well as BIAs from Chinatown ID, Ballard, all over the city. And just some background on this. When Councilmember came to West Seattle last month, as reported in the West Seattle blog, a lot of talk about public safety concerns. The West Seattle Junction Association actually hired private security patrols earlier this year after numerous theft cases, including a smash and grab at a local jewelry store. And David, I really thought about this because I was thinking about these BIAs, which assess a fee from local businesses to have services like security patrols. Where does their work on these issues end, and where does action like help from the Seattle Police Department start? It just seems like a really blurred line to me, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is a tension that came up a lot, especially around the, when there was talk about defunding the police. I think one counter argument around that was that we would see more private security, which is, basically unregulated, less trained police officers. I think there's also there's a little bit of a tension between, what the city can provide, or just government in general can provide kind of to specific businesses or town. We see emphasis patrols in certain neighborhoods or things like that, but police aren't in the business of providing specific security to specific businesses. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of like a PTA or something like that, which is it's not funding the essential school functions, but certain school districts just have more resources because they have parents that can give more money to it. It feels like that. Yeah. Is sort of the risk of some of these BIAs and their approach is, you have certain BIAs that are funding security guards, but other places in the city, they won't be able to afford that. So, it's interesting. I don't have a great answer to it, but I've always found this tension between public police forces and private security being really interesting, just because, it is oftentimes reflective of how certain neighborhoods or businesses view how the city is functioning. But, because security is not there to protect the peace. The security is there to protect business interests. And there are sometimes issues that arise from that. Yeah.
It's a very interesting move, I think, by Councilmember Nelson, too, with the mayor so focused on this downtown revitalization plan. Other neighborhoods need a boost, too. Downtown, of course, is important. But for these smaller neighborhoods, I think the vibrancy of their area is just as important, if not more so.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. There has been, seems like more talk about, maybe not as much lately, but it seemed like for a little while that there was a good amount of talk about, should we be focusing so much on downtown specifically? Should we? And I think some of that probably from COVID, just because there was so much talk about bringing back, vibrancy downtown. But, I think there was a counter argument, which is a lot of neighborhoods outside of downtown are actually doing better because fewer people are going into downtown, and so they're spending their money closer to home. So, it's an interesting balance of, is downtown more important than other neighborhoods?
Yeah, you got to look at that. Thank you, David, for breaking down that piece with me. All right, well, coming up, if you're waiting for a bus right now, you might need to keep on waiting because an alarming number of buses in King County Metro's fleet are needing maintenance and not getting it. We're going to break down what's going on with these breakdowns on Transportation Talk. David, you had a story recently in the Seattle Times about what I thought was a shocking number of buses out for maintenance in King County Metro's fleet, to the point where it's affecting bus service. What's going on?
So we've known that maintenance is an issue for a while because we know that staffing is an issue and we know that supply chain is an issue. And both of those things mean it's, when a bus breaks down, it's harder to fix it. What was surprising to me was just about the story was the extent, it changes day to day, but on a recent Friday, 42% of the roughly 1,500 or so buses that King County Metro has were out with an open work order, which is a huge number of buses. That's more than 600 buses that are sitting there waiting for repairs and are not getting it. The effects of that, in some ways, we are actually already feeling. I think there was some framing that we're seeing new cuts to service at the time of my story's publication. It's not entirely true. The Metro had already announced that they were cutting back service and would continue to do so. I think a lot of people sort of assumed that all just had to do with operators, that there weren't enough drivers to drive these buses. But what these numbers showed me, or that I think actually in some ways the bigger issue is just they don't have people to fix these buses. And you can see that in the numbers, on that Friday report, we saw that, they listed how many buses they would need to deliver for full service that day and how many buses they actually had available. And basically in every area, they were falling short of the number they needed to actually run full service. So it's not unique to King County Metro, I don't think, although I haven't seen the numbers for other agencies. But it's pretty stark just that what it's going to take for King County Metro to actually dig themselves out of that hole.
Yeah, and it sounded like needing personnel and a bit of a supply chain issue too. Like this part is back ordered over here. I mean, that's part of the calculus here too, I guess, with repairing some of these coaches.
Normally, they think it's okay for maybe 5% of buses to be sitting and waiting for parts to show up. In this case, it's like 14% of their buses are sitting idle just because they can't get the parts. So that's 200 buses. They said that even if they had the staff to fix them, they wouldn't be able to do it because they can't get the parts quickly enough. And I'm not a mechanic, so I don't know the specifics of it, but apparently the pieces that go into the hybrid electric engine just take a really long time, and there's not as much. The manufacturer of those parts make those parts to order more so than other parts, apparently, which is, I think, good for their finances. But then when you get in a situation like we have with COVID, where supply chains break down, making things to order it doesn't work as well. Because then once you get backed up, you get really backed up, and it's hard to get out of that. Some buses you couldn't fix even if you had staff, and then other buses, even if you had the parts, you wouldn't be able to fix it because you don't have staff. So how they get out of it, I think it's going to be really tricky because trades in general right now are hurting for staff.
They're suffering.
It's not like just a normal auto mechanic could take this job, because these are pretty advanced machines at this point, because they've got a lot of hybrid electric parts to them. It's not like they're competing with just auto mechanics to get these parts. In some ways, they're competing with like aeronautical companies, because some of these engines are that advanced, and so it takes a real skill set to be able to work on these things. So refilling that roster is going to take more than just rehiring people who were fired for the vaccine mandate.
Wow. Thank you for that story behind the story there, David. Excellent work. Time to wrap up here. And David, I wanted to make sure I touched on this. You had an all-star related concern in the past few days. I think it was a military jet flyover, and your dog was like, I'm out of here. What happened? Update on the dog location, please. What do we got?
Well, I don't know if it's just where we are, but I think they were doing like practice loops around my house. It was like a good 5 minutes of these growlers just rattling our house. And my poor dog, who had just survived the 4th of July, is now traumatized by the All-Star game. And not to mention my 9-month-old baby, who was a little surprised too. He handled it better than the dog, but I don't know. I think there should be a decibel limit on practicing fighter jet flyovers over people's homes.
See what we can do, man. That's rough, but I'm glad dog's back home. Glad your child has calmed down and hang in there. Who knows what the flyover is going to be like over the rest of the week here. Well, thank you, David, for joining me. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Show your support. Thanks also to Converge Media 2 for airing the video version of this podcast, and we will see you soon.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.